Caleb Ward had lived alone on the far edge of the Arizona frontier for so long that even the coyotes seemed to recognize him. They trailed his horse at a respectful distance, never quite coming close, as though they understood something about the man-something in his silence, his steady movements, the air of quiet sorrow that clung to him like desert dust. People in town whispered that Caleb preferred animals to humans, that he avoided company, because he had a cruel streak or because he'd gone half wild in the years since tragedy struck his homestead. The truth was more complicated and far sadder. 5 years earlier, the fever had swept through the territory, taking his wife Clara and their young son before Caleb even understood what symptoms to fear. One morning he had kissed Clara's forehead, warm with what he thought was fatigue. By nightfall she could barely breathe. Their son followed within 2 days. The doctor from town arrived too late, and all he could do was press Caleb's shoulder with helpless sympathy. After burying them beneath a lone mesquite tree, Caleb stopped speaking to most folks and seldom rode beyond his land unless absolutely necessary. The ranch became both refuge and prison. He rose before dawn, worked until his hands cracked, and ate only when hunger forced him. The emptiness of the house was something he never grew used to, so he spent more time in the barn where the horses at least acknowledged him with soft whickers. He rebuilt the north fence twice in a single season for no good reason other than to stay busy. He broke wild mustangs because the raw physicality reminded him he was still alive. And sometimes on the loneliest evenings, he found himself talking aloud as if Clara were still by the hearth, warming her hands on a cup of sassafras tea. Once or twice a month he rode 30 miles to the nearest settlement, Rosewater Creek, but he stayed only long enough to buy what he needed: tobacco, lamp oil, flour, ammunition, and coffee. The townsfolk watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He was polite, never raised his voice, but he lived outside their rhythm of gossip, church, and community gatherings. Children would stare at him from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering that he was the ghost man who only came to town when the moon was thin. Caleb paid them no mind. He didn't blame them. Grief had carved hollows in his face, and a kind of weariness lived behind his eyes. Still, despite the loneliness, he clung to his land with fierce loyalty. Clara had loved this stretch of red earth and open sky. She had planted wildflowers near the well, had dreamed of expanding the ranch, raising a herd of fine horses, and teaching their boy to ride before he could walk. Letting the place go felt like letting the last pieces of her fade, and Caleb couldn't bear that, so he stayed. He worked. He endured. Yet the solitude was beginning to weigh differently on him. In the year before the story begins, he had started waking in the middle of the night, convinced he heard someone calling his name. Sometimes he would step outside with his rifle, scanning the moonlit desert for trespassers, only to find nothing but the wind threading through the sagebrush. Other nights, he would sit on the porch with a lantern burning low, thinking he ought to sell the ranch and move to a mining town, someplace noisy enough to drown out memory. But he never did. Something held him there: habit, grief, loyalty, or perhaps a quiet hope he refused to acknowledge. And it was on one of those restless mornings, when he rose before even the sun had begun pulling light over the mesas, that he saddled his horse and rode out to check the far fence line. He had no idea that by noon his solitary life would be shattered forever. The early morning air carried a crisp bite as Caleb rode out toward the eastern ridge, where the land sloped sharply into a wash crowded with cottonwoods. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, but a thin gray light seeped across the desert, outlining the land in hushed silhouettes. Caleb preferred these dawn rides. They were quiet, predictable, and gave him an excuse to stay away from the empty house a little longer. His horse, a dun gelding named Bramble, picked his way across the rocky ground with steady confidence. Caleb kept one gloved hand on the reins and the other resting loosely on the saddle horn, his rifle tucked in its scabbard. Coyotes yipped faintly in the distant morning calls to one another before retreating to shade. All was as it should be. Until it wasn't. A flicker of movement near the cottonwoods caught his eye. Caleb's first thought was that it might be a stray calf or a pronghorn caught in a thicket. But something about the shape still, hanging, too vertical and too heavy snagged at his instincts. He straightened in the saddle, narrowing his eyes. "There," he muttered to Bramble, nudging him forward. The gelding hesitated. His ears pinned back and he gave a nervous huff. That alone made Caleb tense. Bramble was a level-headed horse. It took more than a rabbit or a rattler to unsettle him. Caleb loosened the strap on his rifle and urged the horse onward. As they approached, the shape sharpened into clarity, a small figure hanging beneath a cottonwood branch, limp and motionless. Caleb's stomach dropped. He kicked Bramble into a sharper trot, then dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. His boots crunched through dry leaves as he rushed toward the tree. It was a girl. A young Apache girl, no more than 14, her wrists bound and suspended by a coarse rope. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves across her face, and her feet barely brushed the earth. Her dress, simple, made of woven doeskin, was torn and smeared with dust. A shallow breath rattled in her chest, proof she was still alive, though barely. But it wasn't her condition that first struck Caleb. It was the wooden plank hanging around her neck, swinging gently in the breeze. Someone had crudely carved words into it with a hunting knife. "White man don't forgive," the message burned into Caleb as sharply as if the knife had carved into him instead. He stared at the sign, stunned, anger rising like a slow boil under his ribs. Who had done this? Settlers? Soldiers? Outlaws? Whoever it was, they had not only wanted her dead, they wanted to send a message. Caleb's pulse hammered. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the surrounding brush for tracks or ambush. No footprints nearby, no abandoned wagons or horses. Whoever had strung the girl up had long since gone or were still watching. He reached for the rope and tested its tension. It held the girl up by her wrists alone, joints twisted unnaturally. A surge of protective urgency overtook him. "You're all right now," he murmured, though he had no idea if she could hear him. "I've got you." He pulled his knife from his belt and sliced through the rope. The girl collapsed into his arms with a soft, pained groan. She was frighteningly light, as though she hadn't eaten in days. Caleb knelt with her carefully, lowering her to the ground and checking her breathing. Barely there, but present. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her, then studied the sign again. Whoever left it wanted bloodshed between whites and Apache. Wanted Caleb, or anyone who found her, to walk away, to agree with the message and leave her to die. He couldn't. He lifted the girl into his arms and carried her to his horse. There was no decision to make, no weighing of consequences. Something deep within him, instinct, conscience, maybe the last living ember of the man he used to be, made the choice for him. He was going to save her, and whatever storm followed would have to be met head-on. Caleb rode hard toward the ranch, the girl's frail body secured in front of him, wrapped in his coat. Every few minutes he lowered a hand to her shoulder or her back, checking for the rise and fall of breath. Each time he felt it shallow and uneven, it steadied him just enough to keep going. The desert blurred past, dust rising beneath Bramble's pounding hooves, yet the weight of what Caleb had just done settled heavily on his mind. Saving her had been instinctive, but keeping her alive, that was a choice with consequences. Apache and settlers lived in a state of uneasy tension. Skirmishes flared often, fueled by raids, accusations, and retaliations that spiraled into cycles of vengeance. White homesteaders feared Apache warriors. Apache families feared soldiers and scalp hunters. Into that powder keg, someone had hung an Apache girl with a message carved into a sign one designed to ignite hatred, and Caleb had cut her down. If soldiers found out, he'd be accused of aiding the enemy. If settlers learned, They'd say he was bringing trouble to their doorstep. And if the Apache discovered she was on his ranch, they might assume he'd been the one who harmed her. Damn the lot of them, he muttered as he rode. He wasn't about to leave a child to die because grown men preferred anger over truth. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was fully rising, flooding the land with gold that felt strangely out of place considering the turmoil knotting inside him. He swung off Bramble and carried the girl into the house, a place he hadn't brought a guest into in years. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and cold ashes. Dust motes drifted in the slanted morning light. Caleb cleared off the long table near the hearth with a sweep of his arm, careful not to jostle her. He laid her down and began inspecting her condition. Her wrists were raw and swollen, rope burns deep enough to bleed. Bruises mottled her arms, shoulders, even the sides of her ribs. Someone had struck her repeatedly. He found a knot on her temple, half hidden by her hair. She had likely been unconscious for hours. Caleb set his jaw, anger sharpening into something cold and focused. He fetched a basin, warmed water over the stove, and tore strips from an old shirt. He worked with steady hands, washing the grime from her face, cleaning the cuts, binding her wrists with salve. When he lifted her eyelids, he saw them flutter, but her gaze didn't focus. Shock, dehydration, exhaustion, maybe all three. "Easy now," he said quietly, more out of habit than expectation she could respond. "You're safe here. Safe." The word sounded fragile. He heard himself think of Clara, how she used to tend injured animals that wandered onto their land. Once she nursed a wounded hawk for weeks. Caleb had told her they should leave it alone. It was wild, dangerous. Clara had only smiled and said, "There's no harm in giving something a chance, Caleb. If we don't, who will?" He swallowed hard and dipped the cloth again. After an hour of slow work, the girl's breathing steadied. Her skin lost some of its gray pallor. Caleb draped a blanket over her and stood back, rubbing his temples. That was when the reality struck him fully. If whoever left her hanging discovered she was alive, they would come for her, and for him. Caleb's ranch was isolated good for hiding, terrible for defense. He moved to the window and scanned the horizon instinctively. Nothing yet. No dust trails, no riders. But they would come. Men who carved a sign like that didn't leave loose ends. He checked the girl once more, then reached for his rifle and hung it by the door. His Colt revolver went on the table beside her. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or why she had been targeted. But he knew this much. He had stepped into the path of a storm, and backing out was no longer an option. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the chair beside the table where the Apache girl lay, his rifle leaned against his knee and a lantern burning low. The house felt different, alive in a way it hadn't since Clara and their boy had been there. Every shift of wind outside, every distant coyote call, made him tighten his grip on the rifle. He expected trouble. He was sure of it. Men who tied a child to a tree didn't simply vanish. The girl stirred just before sunrise. It began with a faint twitch of her fingers. Then her hand slid weakly toward her face as if trying to brush away a dream. Caleb leaned forward, the chair creaking beneath him. "Easy," he said softly. "You're all right." Her eyelids fluttered. For several seconds she looked neither awake nor asleep, caught in that fractured space between consciousness and fear. Then she inhaled sharply and bolted upright. The blanket fell from her shoulders. Her breathing came in short, sharp bursts, eyes wide and wild. She scrambled backward on the table, knocking over the bowl of water Caleb had set beside her. "Whoa now," Caleb said, hands raised. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." She understood the tone if not the words. Her gaze darted from him to the door, to the windows, then to the rope-burn marks on her wrists, as if realizing all at once that she was no longer hanging from that tree. She spoke sharply in Apache words Caleb couldn't grasp, but could feel the fear behind. Her voice trembled, yet there was fire in it too, a stubborn strength refusing to be extinguished. "Don't try to get up yet," Caleb said, shaking his head slowly so she would follow his movements. "You're hurt." She clutched her arms close to her chest and stared at him with suspicion sharpened into a blade. He recognized the look. It was the same look animals gave when caught in traps, terrified, furious, and ready to bite to survive. Caleb exhaled. He had expected this. Trust wasn't something that grew quickly, especially not for a child who had been brutalized and left to die. He pointed gently to himself. "Caleb," she blinked, eyes narrowing as though studying him. Her lips formed around a whisper of a name, Nalin, but she didn't repeat it. She seemed to regret letting even that small piece of herself slip out. "Nalin," he tried. The name felt soft on his tongue, melodic. "All right, good, Nalin." She flinched when he said it, as though hearing her own name spoken by a white man unsettled her further. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders like armor. Caleb moved slowly around the table and held out a canteen. "Water," he said, lifting it slightly. "Drink." Nalin eyed it, then him. Eventually she reached out with trembling fingers and accepted it. The moment the water hit her tongue, she gulped greedily, almost desperately. Caleb had to gently stop her from drinking too much too quickly. Then came the food-simple cornbread and boiled potatoes. She sniffed it first, suspicious, but hunger won out. She ate in small, cautious bites, watching him the entire time as if expecting him to snatch the plate away or worse. "You were in bad shape," Caleb said quietly, pulling up another chair but sitting far enough not to crowd her. "Somebody meant to kill you." She froze mid-bite. Her eyes flicked to his sharp, questioning. Caleb gestured lightly to her wrists, then drew a hand across his own neck in a slicing motion. He mimed the sign she'd been forced to wear, tracing the shape of a board around his chest. Her breathing hitched. She whispered a single Apache word, one filled with hatred and fear. Caleb didn't need translation to know it meant those men. "Yeah," he murmured. "Them." For a long moment they sat in silence, the house holding its breath with them. Then, slowly, as though the truth weighed her down, Nalin slumped forward. Her shoulders trembled. She wasn't crying, not openly, but the pain she held inside was visible in every tense muscle. Caleb felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct. A duty he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. "You're safe here," he said again, quieter. "I'll keep you safe." Nalin didn't look convinced. "Not yet." But she didn't pull away when he covered her with the blanket again. For now, that was enough. For the rest of the morning, Nalin drifted in and out of sleep. Each time she stirred, Caleb paused whatever he was doing, mending tack, heating broth, reloading cartridges to make sure she hadn't slipped back into fever or panic. She still watched him with wary eyes, but the raw edge of terror had dulled into something more guarded, calculated. She was assessing him, measuring the distance between safety and danger. And Caleb understood. Trust wasn't something a child in her position could give freely. By midday, he decided he needed answers. He saddled Bramble and took a slow ride back toward the cottonwoods where he had found her. He left Nalin inside the house with the door bolted, a bucket of water beside the table, and a promise he wasn't sure she understood. "I'll be back before sundown." The land seemed different now, heavier, as if holding its breath. Caleb moved with instinctive caution, scanning the ground and brush as a tracker might. Years of ranch work had sharpened his sense of the land's rhythms. When something was out of place, he felt it first, saw it second. What he saw near the cottonwoods chilled him. Tracks. Several sets of them, 3 horses at least, maybe 4. The prints were deep, made by well-shod hooves, not Apache ponies. Apache horses tended to be smaller, lighter, unshod. These were heavy, likely ridden by white men. He crouched, brushing his fingers lightly over the soil. The tracks were fresh, no more than a day old. He followed them carefully, moving from shadow to shadow beneath the trees. Finally, near the slope of the wash, he found something wedged between two rocks, a scrap of leather. He lifted it and recognized the decorative tooling, immediately geometric patterns popular among freelance scalp hunters. He stiffened. Scalp hunters were the bottom of humanity's barrel. They roamed the frontier under half-legal contracts, paid by towns or private ranchers to control threats, which often meant killing innocent Apache families and selling the scalps to whoever would pay more. Many disguised their raids as retaliation, hoping to keep the fragile peace between the Apache and white settlers shattered beyond repair. Caleb's pulse kicked up. If scalp hunters had taken Nalin, then hung her with a sign blaming white men, it meant one thing: they wanted war. He followed the tracks a bit farther until he found the remains of a small camp still warm, coals glowing beneath a pile of half-burned brush. A broken bottle glinted in the dirt. A piece of jerky lay discarded near boot prints. There were signs of struggle, too. Perhaps where Nalin had tried to fight back before being tied. "She put up a fight," Caleb muttered, respect tugging at his mouth. Good girl. But one detail bothered him more than the rest. The tracks didn't lead toward Apache territory. They led toward the town of Rosewater Creek, toward white settlements. That meant the scalp hunters weren't fleeing after an attack. They were circling, watching, waiting for the chaos their actions would spark. They wanted settlers to find the girl's body and assumed the Apache were sending a message. Then they'd ride to settlers claiming revenge was needed and to the Apache claiming whites had struck first. They were constructing a story with blood as mortar. Caleb felt a cold rage settle in his chest. Not fiery and wild, rather controlled and dangerous. He understood now why they'd hung the girl alive, to push the territory toward war, all while lining their pockets. He mounted Bramble again, scanning the horizon for any hint of riders. The silence was oppressive. The scalp hunters had moved on, but they weren't far. They'd return once they realized the girl was missing, or once they saw tracks leading from the tree to his ranch. Either way, they'd come. Caleb turned Bramble toward home, urging him into a strong, steady gallop. He now knew what kind of monsters he was dealing with. And he knew one more thing: saving Nalin wasn't just compassion. It was stepping into a battle he could never walk away from. Caleb saw the dust cloud long before he saw the riders. He had been chopping wood behind the barn, the rhythmic crack of the axe calming his nerves, when he noticed the faint smear rising in the distance, a shifting curtain of dust against the afternoon sun. It wasn't wind. It was movement. Several riders, approaching fast from the southeast. He lowered the axe and stood still, watching. "Nalin," he muttered under his breath, dropping the tool and heading toward the house. Inside, she sat at the table with her knees pulled to her chest, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked smaller today, worn by exhaustion, but her eyes snapped up the moment the door creaked open. She had learned to read Caleb's face quickly. She tensed immediately, sensing something wrong. "You stay inside," he said, pointing at the floor. "You understand? Stay. Hide." Her gaze flicked toward the window. She heard the riders too, the distant thunder of hooves now becoming unmistakable. Caleb moved to her and gently guided her to the small storage room off the kitchen. It was cramped and dark, lined with sacks of flour and crates of tools. Not a comfortable place, but safe. He pointed again to the floor, then pressed a finger to his lips. "Quiet," she stared at him, breathing quick, but nodded. She trusted him just enough for this. He closed the door behind her and shoved a trunk in front of it, not enough to trap her, but enough so anyone entering wouldn't immediately think to look there. Then he grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch. Dust rolled toward the ranch like an advancing storm. As the riders came into view, Caleb counted 3 of them, broad-shouldered men, rough and sunburned, with long coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Their horses were coated with dust, sleek and restless. The men rode with the easy confidence of seasoned killers. Caleb recognized the one in the lead even before the man spoke. Eli Thatcher, a known scalp hunter. Rumors said Thatcher had once sold the scalps of a whole Apache family for the price of a month's wages. Other rumors said he de-killed 2 soldiers who tried to arrest him and buried them in a dry wash somewhere south of the river. Rumors, Caleb knew, always held a kernel of truth. Thatcher reined in sharply, stopping a dozen yards from the porch. His grin was slow and oily. "Well now," he drawled, "if it ain't Caleb Ward. Heard you've been keeping busy." Caleb held his rifle loosely at his side. "Afternoon. You find anything interesting on your morning ride?" Thatcher asked, eyes narrowing with an unsettling sort of amusement. "Nope." Thatcher chuckled. "That so?" He nodded to the men behind him. Both shifted in their saddles, hands near their holsters. "See, we lost something. A piece of property. Little Apache scrap. Ran off on us." Caleb's jaw tightened. "A child ain't property. To me, anything I catch is mine." Thatcher spat into the dirt. "And this one was gonna fetch a good price." Caleb didn't move. "I ain't seen her." Thatcher's smile widened. "Funny. Someone cut her down from a tree we left her on. Someone took her tracks straight in this direction." Caleb's fingers tightened on the rifle stock. The hunters watched him with predatory patience, like wolves waiting for a twitch. "I keep to myself," Caleb said. "You boys know that." "Yes," Thatcher agreed. "That's why it's real strange you de-risk trouble for a little Apache rat." His eyes hardened. "We're gonna take a look around." Caleb stepped off the porch, planting himself squarely between them and his home. "No, you ain't." Tension snapped like a pulled wire. One of Thatcher's men shifted his horse forward an inch. Caleb raised the rifle slightly, not aiming yet, but making the message clear. Thatcher studied him for a long, cold moment. Then he sighed as though disappointed. "Caleb, you don't want to start something you can't finish." "I didn't start anything," Caleb said. "You did." A beat of silence. Dust swirled. Finally, Thatcher nudged his horse sideways, turning away. "We'll be back," he said over his shoulder. "And next time, we ain't gonna be so polite." The riders galloped off, leaving a trail of dust and a tightening knot in Caleb's gut. They knew they'd be back. And the storm had officially arrived. Caleb didn't move until the last traces of dust from the scalp hunters disappeared behind the ridge. Only then did he lower his rifle, the adrenaline fading just enough for his hands to start trembling. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself, then hurried back inside. Nalin was already out of the storage room, crouched in the corner with the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, frightened, but alive. She studied Caleb's face as though trying to read whether he had won or lost whatever battle took place outside. "They're gone," he said softly. "For now." She swallowed and looked toward the windows, her breathing uneven. Caleb knelt so he could meet her eye level. "Listen to me, Nalin. They're not going to stop. Those men will come back maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. If they find you here—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The memory of the trees still lived in her eyes. She pressed her lips together and waited, tense but attentive. "We gotta move," Caleb said. "I'm tacking you back to your people." Her eyes widened slightly, shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like hope quickly smothered by suspicion. She spoke in her own language, short and hesitant. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he understood the question. "Why would you do this for me? Why risk everything?" He answered the only way he could. "Because it's right. Because you don't deserve what they did. Because someone needs to protect you until you get home." She lowered her gaze, uncertain, but she didn't object. That was enough. By late afternoon, Caleb had packed essentials: blankets, dried meat, a coil of rope, ammunition, and a small tin of salve for Nalin's wrists. He saddled Bramble and led out a second horse, a chestnut mare named Rosebud, gentle and steady enough for a weakened rider. When Nalin stepped outside, she paused at the threshold as though the open world felt too vast after the terror she survived. Caleb offered his hand. She hesitated before taking it, letting him help her onto the mare. She sat awkwardly at first, weak and unbalanced, but adjusted quickly, gripping the saddle horn with determined fingers. "That's it," he said, mounting Bramble. "Stay close." They rode west, toward the Canyonlands' rugged country carved with hidden paths and winding gorges where the scalp hunters' horses couldn't easily follow. The sun dipped lower as they traveled, painting the rocks in shades of copper and blood red. For the first hour, Nalin said nothing. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning for danger. Caleb kept a steady pace, glancing back often to check her posture, her grip, her breathing. Finally, she broke the silence, not with words, but a soft sound. A hum, a low tune, barely audible at first, trembling with uncertainty. It sounded like a song someone might sing to a frightened child on a long journey home. Caleb listened quietly. "Is that a prayer?" he asked gently. She paused, searching his face. Then she tapped her chest once, then pointed upward toward the open sky. "For protection." "I reckon that's a good idea," he said. "Pray all you want." A faint shadow of a smile flickered across her lips before disappearing again. They continued deeper into the Canyonlands. As the terrain grew more treacherous, Caleb taught her subtle cues, how to lean when the horse descended a slope, how to keep her balance on rocky paths. She listened carefully, mimicking his posture with surprising quickness despite her exhaustion. At dusk, they paused for water at a narrow creek. As Nalin cupped the cool water to her lips, Caleb noticed something change in her posture. She stiffened, staring at the canyon rim. He followed her gaze. A thin line of dust rose in the distance. The scalp hunters had found their trail. Caleb's heartbeat hammered. "We move," he said sharply. "Now." Nalin didn't speak, but she scrambled back onto the mare, fear burning through her fatigue. They rode hard into the gathering shadows, two fugitives bound by desperation, trust beginning to form in the cracks of fear. And behind them, closing the distance with every heartbeat, the hunters rode fast. Part 8 pushes the story into darker, sharper territory. Up to this point, Matt Crawford and Nalin have been gathering fragments, clues, half-truths, subtle inconsistencies to understand who is actually behind the violence on both sides. Now in this section, the narrative tightens around a single discovery, a blood trail leading them to the truth no one wanted uncovered. This part begins with Nalin waking before dawn, troubled by what she overheard in the previous section. The suspicious behavior of Sheriff Briggs and his quiet exchange with strangers near the creek. Her instincts, shaped by years of listening, observing, surviving, tell her something is off. Matt, too, senses the tension. His ranch feels watched. His animals are restless. It's as if the land itself is holding its breath. A riderless horse is found wandering near the northern ridgeblood on the saddle, reins torn, flanks trembling. Matt recognizes it as belonging to one of Briggs' deputies. That is the moment where Part 8 ignites. The mystery is no longer a political puzzle or a collection of vague suspicions. It becomes physical evidence. Something happened in the night. Something violent. Matt and Nalin track the blood trail together, moving through juniper bushes and rocks still warm from the day before. The quiet between them carries weight. He trusts her tracking skills more than any White Scout, and she trusts his steadiness. The deeper they follow the trail, the more the truth peels back in layers. They find broken branches, footprints overlapping, some from the deputy, some from unfamiliar boots, definitely not Apache moccasins. Further down, spent shells lie gleaming between the rocks. Fresh, recently fired. And then they find a deputy's body, slumped against a boulder, throat slit cleanly, but with an arrow deliberately planted in his chest, an Apache arrow. But Nalin knows immediately, it's staged. The feathers are wrong. The wood is wrong. The cuts on the body don't align with how her people kill or hunt. She explains every detail to Matt, her voice steady, but inside, the discovery stirs a storm. Someone is killing settlers, then planting Apache weapons to force a war. Someone wants bloodshed so badly they're manufacturing it. Matt's jaw tightens. He knows who benefits from chaos: men who profit from selling land, men who want the Apache expelled, men who want to consolidate power. The kind of men Sheriff Briggs has been having secret meetings with. They bury the deputy quietly. No ceremony, no witnesses. If Briggs learns they've seen this, he will twist the truth before they can speak. Matt decides they need proof, something irrefutable. But for that, they must follow the rest of the trail, which leads into a ravine that locals avoid. Rumors say thieves once hid there. Now, Matt and Nalin suspect something far worse. As they descend, Nalin becomes hyper-alert. She notices tracks. Multiple men moving in formation, carrying heavy loads. And she spots something else: imprints from crates dragged along the ground. This raises an alarming possibility. Weapons trade, smuggling, a militia forming. The tension rises when they hear voices echoing faintly through the rocks. Men laughing, metal clanking. Matt and Nalin duck behind a boulder. As they inch closer, they spot a hidden camp: white men polishing rifles, tying Apache-style feathers to arrows, painting counterfeit tribal symbols on shields. It's a grotesque mimicry, a factory of deception. And watching over them, giving orders, is someone Matt recognized as a wealthy cattle baron who has long coveted Apache land and rancher water rights. The ends with Matt and Nalin quietly withdrawing, knowing they must expose this operation before the false flag violence destroys everything. But the enemy has already noticed something is off. Footprints near camp. A stone disturbed. Part 8 closes with the chilling realization they are being hunted. Caleb and Nalin moved cautiously through the canyon's shadowed trails. The night air cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and rock. The scalp hunters' camp had been discovered, but escaping it had not come without cost. Nalin's small hands bore new scrapes, and Caleb's prideful confidence was shaken by the realization that his choices had pulled them into a conflict far larger than he'd anticipated. Finally, after 2 days of careful travel and evasive maneuvering, they reached Nalin's village, a hidden settlement nestled along a narrow stream, surrounded by mesas that blocked prying eyes. The Apache had been wary of strangers for decades, and the arrival of a white man, even one who carried a child to safety, was cause for suspicion. As they approached, Nalin ran ahead. Her small frame moved with surprising swiftness and agility, a ghost against the shadows. Caleb followed, hands raised in an open gesture of peace, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The villagers emerged cautiously, their expressions guarded. Mothers held children closer. Warriors moved to the edges, bows and knives ready, eyes fixed on the outsider. Nalin's mother, a tall woman with sharp, discerning eyes, appeared first. Her gaze pierced Caleb with the intensity of a hawk. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice low but firm, commanding attention. Caleb lowered his eyes respectfully, knowing that any false gesture could be fatal. "My name is Caleb Ward," he said carefully. "I am a rancher. I found Nalin hanging in a tree. Someone left her for dead." The crowd tensed. The words were simple, but in this world, words alone were not enough. Caleb's voice faltered slightly, then steadied as he continued. "I brought her here. I did not harm her. I protected her. And I swear, anyone who tries to hurt her again, I will stop them." Nalin stepped forward, gripping Caleb's hand lightly, then loosening it to address her people. "He saved me," she said in Apache, her voice trembling but clear. He carried me to safety. He did not harm me. He spoke truth." The council elders exchanged wary glances, murmuring among themselves. Years of distrust between their people and white settlers could not be erased in a single moment. Caleb waited silently, giving them space to speak, his every instinct alert to the slightest sign of hostility. Finally, the eldest warrior, a man with silver streaks in his hair and a deep scar across his cheek, spoke. "We will listen," he said. "But words alone are not proof. Bring us the story, man of the white lands." Caleb nodded. Carefully, he recounted everything: the girl hanging in the tree, the sign carved with hate, the scalp hunter's pursuit, the hidden motives, the false flag attempt to ignite war. He explained the discovery of the stolen weapons, the planted feathers, and the men attempting to provoke bloodshed on both sides. The elders listened in silence, their eyes hard and calculating. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then Nalan's mother spoke, her voice firm and unwavering. "You speak truth. You risk your life for my child. That cannot be denied." One of the younger warriors stepped forward. "How can we trust him? How do we know this is not another trap?" Caleb's hand instinctively went to his rifle, then he relaxed it. "Because I have no claim here," he said. "I brought her back. Nothing more. And I will leave if you command it. But I will not stand by while lies and violence destroy both your people and mine." The elders conferred quietly, weighing the man's honesty against centuries of fear and betrayal. Finally, the eldest spoke again. "You saved her life. That is an action, not a word. Your courage speaks louder than the lies of our enemies. You may stay for now as a friend. But remember, one wrong step and our people will act." Caleb bowed slightly. "I understand." Relief and gratitude flickered across Nalan's face. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe fully, her small hand brushing Caleb's arm in a gesture of trust. In this moment, the fragile bridge between the two worlds began to form, not with words or treaties, but through actions and courage, proving that even in a land scarred by hate, trust could be earned and honor could be recognized. The night fell, cool and quiet, as the village settled back into routine, the weight of danger still looming, but now tempered by the promise of an ally, one who had stepped into the storm and survived. The days following Caleb's arrival in the Apache village were tense but purposeful. While Nalan slowly recovered from her injuries, Caleb and a small party of scouts, both Apache and sympathetic settlers, prepared to confront the scalp hunters who had orchestrated the attacks. The village elders, having accepted Caleb's honesty and courage, allowed him to assist, but with the clear understanding that any misstep could undo the fragile trust he had earned. Nalan, now stronger and more alert, stayed close to her mother during these preparations. But she remained Caleb's guide when the scouts ventured into the canyons. Her knowledge of the land, paths, and hidden passages was invaluable. Together, they traced the hunters' movements to a secluded canyon hideout, a place where stolen goods, weapons, and supplies were stockpiled, clearly intended to inflame conflicts between settlers and Apache alike. The confrontation was swift and calculated. Caleb and the Apache warriors moved silently through the rocks, surrounding the camp at dawn. The hunters, caught off guard, tried to flee, but the combined forces blocked every escape route. A few resisted, but they were overpowered without unnecessary bloodshed. Weapons were confiscated, and the leaders, including Eli Thatcher, were captured. Caleb ensured that evidence of their schemes, the stolen feathers, painted arrows, and falsified documents, was preserved. When the Apache Council arrived at the scene, the full truth became clear. The scalp hunters' plan had been simple: manipulate both communities into war to profit from chaos and land grabs. The council's fury was tempered by the proof Caleb and Nalan had collected. Justice, swift and deliberate, was carried out. The hunters were delivered to the proper authorities, their deception and violence exposed. Peace, fragile but renewed, began to settle across the canyons. Back in the village, life returned to its rhythm. Nalin was no longer a frightened, trembling child. She laughed and played with other children, her trust slowly expanding beyond the boundaries of survival. Caleb remained in the village for several days, learning from the elders, understanding the depth of their culture, and recognizing that courage and honor were not limited to a single people. Before leaving, Caleb stood before the council. "I cannot stay," he said quietly. "My home is beyond the canyon, my life is there. But I promise, if any danger comes to your people or to Nalin, I will return. You have my word." The eldest warrior studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You have walked through our fires and proven yourself. Go, but remember, a bridge once built can be crossed from both sides." Nalin approached Caleb, her small hand slipping into his. "Will you come back?" she asked softly, hope and uncertainty mingling in her voice. "I will," Caleb said, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "And not just for you." Months later, Nalin and her mother visited Caleb's ranch. The boy who once lived in the shadow of loss now found himself surrounded by life, laughter, and stories shared across cultures. Nalin brought gifts from her people-woven blankets, hand-carved tools, and small trinkets of her village tokens of gratitude and friendship. Caleb, who had been a solitary figure for so long, finally understood that trust and compassion could build bridges even in a land scarred by hatred. The final image lingers. Caleb standing on the porch of his ranch, watching Nalin run through the fields with other children, the sun setting behind the mesas. The red rocks glow warmly in the light, as if forgiving the violence of the past. A sense of peace settles over him, tempered by the knowledge that vigilance is never-ending, but trust earned through courage and honor can endure. In this moment, the frontier is no longer a place of division, but a space where two worlds, once separated by fear and hatred, have learned to coexist. Caleb may still be a lone rancher in some ways, but he is no longer alone in spirit. Through his actions, he has forged a bridge between worlds, a testament to the power of courage, empathy, and unwavering integrity.